Hello and welcome to another Atypling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Today I'm going to give you, in this Ukraine War Update Extra, some fairly juicy discussion points actually. There's quite a bit to talk about. And I'd be really interested in what your opinions are on some of the things I say. I'm going to say a few speculative things, but I will signpost the fact that they are speculative because I don't want to be spreading sort of misinformation at all. So let's just start with our map. So here's the map of Ukraine, and I just want to talk about a couple of things first, which is there could be an argument that Ukraine might benefit from pushing more in the wintertime against demoralized Russian forces. So this is just an idea I've been thinking about recently, and it came up in the comment thread yesterday. So we know that the Russian army does not have decent supplies in terms of winter gear. Okay, well, they are struggling to get, your everyday equipment. They've been asking for body armor and helmets from Turkey. Turkey have refused, and we're fairly sure that that they just don't have the winter gear that they need. So you can imagine that as the winter draws in, and generally in wintertime, warfare grinds to a halt. You look at Afghanistan, they had sort of fighting seasons. Well, in Ukraine, it could be the same, as the mud really screws things over. The Rasputitsa, the seasonal autumnal and spring mud, and the rains that bring that as well, cause a bit of mayhem for forces. You then go into the frozen period of the winter, and people possibly not moving so much, attacking so much. There's a lot more cloud cover, and that really affects drones. And drones are your eyes in the air that direct artillery and rocket attacks. Now, if you're unable to get them in the air because of low cloud cover, then things don't happen as much. But there is an argument to say that might be a good time to really press the Russians if their morale is low. They're full of conscripts that are really poorly equipped. They're freezing, literally freezing cold. And if you then throw actual warfare on top of that, then you could really take advantage of a demoralized armed forces. And so just speculatively wondering whether the Ukrainians might be thinking, instead of drawing back in wintertime, maybe actually pressing on to see if the psychology of that could really affect those Russians. I don't know. You've got to remember as well that some of these Russian soldiers will already have been in the field for about a year. Okay, so this has been going on since February the 24th. We're now moving towards October, so that's 8 months. Plus, some of these troops will have been, out in the field in Russia and training and on exercise when they were called up to do this war. So that you can imagine by wintertime, some of these guys would have been fighting constantly or out in the field for a year. That is pretty phenomenal, and that will affect morale. It will affect psychology to a great degree, and I think that's definitely worth considering when you are talking about rotation or the lack of rotation and the morale and psychology of your troops. So something else to think about there. This is a speculative thing I want to bring up, and I'm wondering whether the West and NATO, in fighting this proxy war, which I think it is, for good reason, of course, in defending the sovereign nationhood of Ukraine, it appears that the West and NATO are providing only just enough equipment to get the Ukrainians to a winning situation. Now, you could argue that they're doing this to avoid escalation. If they brought in NASAMS and Iris and HIMARS straight away at the beginning of the war, that might have seemed as too escalatory. So it had to be this gradual move towards greater and greater pieces of equipment. But Russia really haven't reacted to any of this equipment in any particularly hardcore manner. The Kerch Bridge, they just bombed a load more stuff that they were doing anyway. In other words, they could have, the West and NATO could have gone straight in with those, and we could now already be onto battle tanks and, fighter jets, NATO fighter jets. And it could be to avoid escalation, but it could. I wonder if there's a thought, and here's my question to you, as to whether NATO and the West think that doing it this way bleeds the Russian armed forces dry to a point where you are completely debilitating their capabilities in a way that wouldn't have happened if you'd had a flashbang war that maybe Ukraine won, but they won within 2 months because they were given all this amazing kit. That smashed the Russians out of the way a bit, but actually doesn't completely debilitate them. They just kind of win the war quickly, but Russia have got most of their equipment still left. Doing it this way, the Russians are drawing more and more equipment in, getting stuff from Belarus, fixing up old T-62s, bringing them in to go into the meat grinder, and that just gets taken out. So at the end of this campaign, this war, and you could say, are the West and NATO using Ukraine such that this war completely debilitates the Russian armed forces, particularly the army, that they are at a point that they won't be able to recover for decades, because we haven't just gone bosh, smacked them out in some big symbolic significant way, but effectively left them with a load of capability still. And I don't know whether that's part of the thought process or whether that's just incidental. It's like, we don't want to escalate it, so we're going to do it this way. And actually, it just so happens that this way also bleeds the Russians dry in a way that they won't be able to recover for decades, in a way that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Anyway, that's my kind of chat about stuff. Let's go and have a look at a little bit about stuff that's going on, and talk about, bleeding them dry and seeing all these old-fashioned pieces of kit being drafted in. Here come the new reinforcements for Russia. Well, not so new, maybe newly removed from the scrap heap. They have lost a lot of tanks. Scraping the barrel now, though this barrel looks like it'll fall off. So this is just Tim White, just commenting on the fact that this just doesn't look a particularly new bit of kit that's being drafted in to support the Russian offensive, or possibly defensive now. So I know it's just one picture of one unit, but we've seen whole train loads of T-62s and factories of them being sort of regenerated, if you like. Okay, there's some bad news for the Ukrainians in the fact that they've lost a bunch of planes. So this is in the Vinnytsia region. Now, there are two sets of planes that have been lost. So this one is in Vinnytsia, which is, if Kyiv is there, Vinnytsia is over here, right? So look how far that is away from anywhere. And you've got another two planes I'm going to talk about in the Poltava region. I think lost somewhere around about here. A long way from any front line, but what they're doing generally is taking out cruise missiles and drones that have been sent to hit these towns and cities around the interior of Ukraine. But this has been costly for the Ukrainians. So here we've had a wreckage of a MiG-29 fighter during an AD mission against Russian Shahed 136 drones and cruise missiles. So according to some sources, a jet flew into the remains of a destroyed drone or was damaged by the shrapnel of its warhead, causing a loss of control. I'm sure some experts will correct me here, but I think some of the air-to-air missiles that are fired don't explode on a plane, but explode in such a way that the shrapnel of the exploding missile rip through the plane. And so if you have exploding missiles hitting a very small drone, comparatively speaking, then there's little bits of shrapnel fly off, and shrapnel from the exploding missile fly off. And if the plane is flying through that, then you can be in trouble. Or the same for a cruise missile, exactly the same process. So that appears to be what's happened to this one in Vinnytsia. But then we have two in successive days. So in the Poltava region, which again, just to remind you, is up here, so sort of southwest of Kharkiv. In the Poltava region, we have an Air Force plane crashing near the same small town in successive days, two of them. The incidents happened in Shashaki, around 30k northwest of Poltava. Locals say two pilots ejected from the Su-24 Seen here, no further details released. And to be honest, that's the key. You've still got the pilots, so they can fly another day, because replacing pilots is very difficult. Replacing jets is a lot easier, at least it would be for the Russians. For the Ukrainians, possibly less so, because they have fewer capability and fewer capacity, really, in terms of their hardware in the air. So that will hurt, but at least the pilots, not only from a human perspective, survived, but from the capability and capacity of the Ukrainian Air Force. So there you go. And 2 Ukrainian Air Force jets reportedly crashed near Poltava. So here we have what Twitter has to say about this event. We have 2 jets, falling from the sky. What's going on there? This is a long way. This is Poltava. So again, to remind you, this is here. So a long way from surface to air missiles. It makes you wonder exactly what happened to these jets. It seems very unlikely that they were shot down, but there's certainly no evidence that they were shot down, but they could have been, I guess. Then the pro-Russian way of interpreting this, and this is from Jeremy Time Will Tell, which is such a terrible account, laughably incorrect on virtually every prediction and claim this guy makes. It's a real Russian bot here. But Ukraine sacrificing fighter jets to stop drones and missiles. That is an interesting point, and you can argue whether that has been worthwhile. Planes shot down by SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, over Poltava. I'm not aware. I mean, this could have happened, but and again, look, this is just a repetition here. So it's just, whenever you see this, that this is Russian bot activity. I think that's a very charitable interpretation to the Russians, and almost certainly an element of propaganda going on there. But certainly a loss for the Ukrainians, for sure. Okay. Kyiv calls for air defenses as Putin brings in Syria tactics to Ukraine. So the importance of air defenses being that you have these installations around cities so that you don't have your jets flying up and trying to take out these missiles and drones, that they are taken out from the ground in a much safer manner. But the reason I'm mentioning this now is that, because you've heard me say this before, is to talk about the butcher of Syria. So the reason we see this kind of retaliation, I think, after the Kerch Bridge was hit, is because of the guy that Putin put in charge of the forces, a guy called Sergei Surovikin, who was in charge of the Russian forces in Syria on and off from 2017 to 2020. So he's been put in charge of this war, and he's known as the butcher of Syria. And he basically, was arguably responsible for the flattening of places in Syria, using this kind of very brutal tactic of just indiscriminately, or arguably very discriminately, bombing civilian targets, and so on and so forth. So there was this idea, I seem to remember, in Syria, where they found out I think it was some humanitarian organization said to Russia, please do not hit these 24 hospitals, and gave them the locations of 24 hospitals in Syria. And then Russia took that information and then bombed 24 hospitals in Syria. They literally took on the geolocation of the 24 hospitals and bombed them. You might need to check that out and fact check that. I'd hate to be completely incorrect, but I'm fairly sure I remember that happening. And that was a worry at the beginning of this war in Ukraine, that they would do the similar thing. And in fact, they were bombing hospitals in exactly the same way, copying those same tactics right at the beginning of this war. But here we've got Surovikin, who is not going to be good news for Ukraine, because he will be brutal. He's got a checker pass himself. So he was part of a coup, actually, and then he was put in prison for a little while for corruption and sort of embezzling finances. But then he's found favor again with what he's done in Syria, and Putin has put him in charge of the forces. And as I say, doesn't bode particularly well. Okay, let's move on to a quick discussion of something called fifth generation warfare. This is a comment by one of my commenters on the last video, uh, defective, he really, I presume he really incisive comments quite often. Would you be willing to tell users about fifth generation warfare tactics, and more specifically how the Kremlin uses fifth gen information warfare to control its people and divide its enemies? An example of this is the X-ray truck photo from Kerch. I know everyone had a giggle about the obviously wrong truck X-ray, but really we should not be laughing. So I showed you that and how they completely messed up the X-ray because it wasn't the truck that was used in very easily discernible ways. This is an example of fifth gen warfare where the point is not to convince people that this photo is correct. The point is to flood the information space with multiple competing and contradictory narratives so that the truth then becomes only one of a large number of narratives. So on and so forth. So this is a really good point, and I talked about this. Vlad Vexler talks about this quite a lot with regard to whether the mobilization is a good thing or not, and they kind of sounded it out there, saw what people thought, and had these competing narratives, and then picked the one that they picked the way of doing it that they thought would cause the least amount of hassle for them. But they quite often put loads of stuff into the information space just to see how it falls, and no one of these narratives is true, but they're just sort of testing the ground, that kind of thing. Anyway, what does fifth generation warfare even mean? So you've got 4 generations of conventional warfare that I'll just really quickly explain. So first generation warfare refers to kind of, think about Romans and Greeks and phalanxes of troops just clashing against each other. There are sort of city states against city states, that kind of 2 forces against each other. That's your first generation warfare. You then move on to second generation warfare around First World War, which is increased technology. So second generation warfare incorporates first generation warfare, right? So it's just a progression on from that point. And it takes into account new technology and the ability to kill people more efficiently. That sounds horrible. More quickly, and greater mobility. Third generation warfare then is kind of the interwar period and onwards, and in fact up to now. So third generation warfare would include like air forces, stealth fighters, guided missiles, ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear warfare, that kind of thing. It's still conventional nation state against nation state in increasingly more sophisticated ways, but you're still kind of killing each other with these means, or winning battles and wars with these more conventional means. Fourth generation warfare is that, but then it's looking at, it's not nation state against nation state, but it's often nation states against non-state players. So it might be Al Qaeda, it might be FARC, it might be ideological groups, insurgencies. So this is insurgency warfare, and it's and that's kind of actually what the US Army pretty much trains for these days a lot more. These come from these. I've just nicked some pictures from if you want to find a really interesting video that talks about this: fifth generation warfare history, modern context, and some solutions. So that's well worth watching. I've just taken some screen grabs because these are quite useful. So that's that. So what's fifth generation warfare? Well, if we've gone on from insurgency, what is it? Well, what we're referring to are not changes in the instruments of war, the technology of war, the modes of war, or the forms of war. What we're referring to is a function of war. So we've got a step towards a whole different paradigm of looking at what war is. And here's another definition. We are no longer fighting a defined adversary in a defined battle space for a defined period of time. Instead, the fifth generation mission space is a continuous global battle of narratives that will play out over both virtual and physical space and encompass a range of violent and non-violent actions and effects. And the thing is, this can also encompass non-state players such as corporations, right? This is where Google, Starlink, all these players are involved in the Heartland Institute in the US, for example, that has and ESO and Mobile have now admitted this. For 40 years they've been producing disinformation about climate change, right? So they've been climate change skeptics, but it's all about controlling the narrative. And then you put stuff out there, and then, well, this narrative competes with this narrative. I've been told climate change is real, and now I'm being told that actually it's not real. And so you got all these narratives. Who do I believe? And then you go to your, like, who you want to believe, effectively. You believe what you want to believe, and you go to things that are convenient for you to believe because it doesn't affect other things you believe. And so you kind of group your beliefs together. And anyway, just the way that we come to our conclusions means that we are in a place of, some people call, epistemic security, right, or insecurity. So before, we've got like cybersecurity, we've got I don't know, other forms of security, national security, this kind of security. But now we have epistemic security. So in philosophy, epistemology is knowledge and truth, right? So we're in a place of epistemic insecurity. Then we are fighting over what knowledge and truth is, and that's kind of what the fifth generation kind of space is about. The battle space is about. The battlefield will be something strange: cyberspace, or the Cleveland water supply, or Wall Street's banking systems, or YouTube. The mission will be instilling fear, and it will succeed. That's one idea of what it is. So it's about controlling the narratives, and the ways that you can control narratives just through using code. Think about how Russia got involved in the 2016 presidential election in America and the 2016 EU referendum in the UK, and seek to do that to undermine what is going on, say, in Europe or in America. And the Russia are very supportive of, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary, of Serbia, and other sort of. Even though you might argue that Russia's come from a place of the far left in state communism, actually they're really kind of authoritarian now and have elements of the far right, and there's kind of all mix of everything, but it's kind of totalitarian, authoritarian, and they are sending narratives out into Europe that hopefully find a place and gain traction, so that they are supporting the far right in Europe, because that will make these nations unstable, and will create fear and division amongst the people in Europe, that will then, manifest in the EU falling apart. So if they can succeed in doing that without sending in tanks and missiles, then that's a lot cheaper. If they just have bot factories sitting in Moscow, full of people just tapping away and doing code and putting stuff on Twitter, then that's really cheap, and they're not going to lose human lives. That is their way of doing warfare. So what we're seeing in Ukraine is a mixture of all of these, all of these generations of warfare. But bear in mind what goes on in terms of the fifth generation warfare, and throwing out narratives, and what narrative you as a listener are wanting to hold on to and end up holding on to. Think about, so as a philosopher, I'm always worried about motivated reasoning. So motivated reasoning is, why do I believe that? Why do I want to believe that? Am I believing that because I want to, as opposed to believing that because I've got the best evidential basis to believe that? Okay, this is super, super important. So when when you guys are watching my channel, and I'm talking about Ukraine stuff, or Defense Politics Asia, or New World Economics, or whatever, or Weeb Union, and all these that war in Ukraine, what's their narrative, and why do you like that channel over another channel? And is there confirmation bias going on, so that you ascribe more value to what they are saying or I am saying because you agree with my position or whatever? Just always question yourself. You're the easiest person to fool. So just be aware that you are part of this fifth generation battle space. This channel is part of that, and we just always need to be questioning narratives and questioning the information we are given, and making sure that we're as justified as possible in believing what we believe. Okay, that's what I spend my life doing in philosophy, but actually it's super relevant here. And I hope that doesn't bore you. I hope this isn't boring for you, because I'm not showing you pictures of stuff blowing up. But this is super, super important. Now, for a bit of stuff that you can go away, this is homework, right? For a bit of homework, if you want to watch some fascinating documentaries that kind of talk about these issues, there's an absolutely phenomenal documentary. I just got shivers. Oh, I've got goosebumps. There's an absolutely phenomenal documentary maker, a British guy called Adam Curtis, and he's made some really fantastic. Even if you don't have iPlayer, which is the BBC's kind of interface. You can find these for free online. You can find them on Vimeo, Dailymotion, or on YouTube or wherever else. So the ones I suggest you watch are actually, the first one would be The Power of Nightmares. It really gives you an understanding of how the Power of Nightmares. There you go. There it is. There's three. There's actually three. It says only one there. There's three. That's a final episode. So watch all three of the Power of Nightmares episodes. That will really give you an understanding of how the the war on terror started, and the decades before that, and our idea of building up narratives. Bitter Lake and Hypernormalization. These are really, really must views, and it's so easy to simplify the narratives to an us and them, a good and bad, and actually life is way more complicated than that. But yeah, watch those Adam Curtis documentaries. Let me know what you think about fifth generation warfare, and do you think this is as important as I do? And Defective, the guy who actually prompted me to talk about this, so thank you for that. I do try and read your stuff, guys and girls. So back to normal stuff or whatever. Phillips O'Brien's here saying, so news today is that the 10,000 troops that have been trained in the UK, not just by UK trainers, by the way, they're trainers from around the world, New Zealand, Australia, I think, and other European nations, Canadians, I think, whatever. Correct me if I'm wrong. But an international coalition of trainers have been training troops in the UK, and the UK training is pretty good. I'm not saying that just because I'm British. I'm led to believe it is pretty decent, and they're quite good at training urban warfare, which is particularly prevalent now. There is a question about, should we be training these guys on artillery, how to do it, and then how to receive it, because most people are dying at the end of artillery. Whatever, but this is got to be better than the training the Russian conscripts are getting. And so that's fantastic that you're now going to start seeing these 10,000 being put back into the Ukrainian front lines, in the same way that you're seeing the Russian mobilized conscripts being thrown into their lines. But hopefully there's a disparity in training such that the Ukrainians are better equipped to do warfare. So this is Shashank Joshi, who writes for The Economist, and he's referring to a piece in The Guardian. Quite something to see EU foreign policy official threaten Russia's army with annihilation. And we'll just have a look at this because it is pretty interesting stuff. So first of all, there's just been a UN General Assembly. 3/4 of the 193-member UN General Assembly, 143 companies voted on Wednesday in favour of a resolution condemning Russia's attempted illegal annexation of the 4 partially occupied regions. Only 4 countries joined Russia in voting against the resolution: Syria, Nicaragua, North Korea, and Belarus. So, who are your friends? 35 countries abstained from the vote, including Russia's strategic partner China, while the rest did not vote. So it's a pretty resounding message being sent there by the UN. But the end of the article, and this is fascinating, and I mentioned Josep Borrell before, who's a former Spanish foreign minister. I know that he got into a bit of trouble in Spain for being, I think maybe a little bit of corruption going on and stuff. I'm not 100% sure. I don't know his history, but some people are saying in the comments. But this is absolutely fascinating. At the opening of a diplomacy academy in Brussels, the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, warned Putin of his army's annihilation, despite the French President Emmanuel Macron saying on Wednesday that his country would not use its nuclear arsenal in such circumstances. So the context here is, and I think America, the US and NATO have actually communicated to Russia that if Russia uses nuclear warfare, they will be hit. But most people seem to think that the retaliation would not be nuclear; it would be conventional warfare. But they'll be hit really hard, like the Black Sea Fleet will be taken out straight away, type thing. So Borrell, a former Spanish foreign minister, said Putin, quote, Putin is saying he is not bluffing. Well, he cannot afford bluffing, and it has to be clear that the people supporting Ukraine in the European Union and the member states and the United States and NATO are not bluffing either. Any nuclear attack against Ukraine will create an answer, not a nuclear answer, but such a powerful answer from the military side that the Russian army will be annihilated. Wow. So he's either just making that up, right, which I think is unlikely, or he knows what the plans are for NATO and the West to retaliate to the use of nuclear if Russia used nuclear. And that is absolutely fascinating. So the Russian army will be annihilated. So I'd imagine NATO would just go in and flatten the military capabilities of Russia. Toot sweet. Okay, a couple of nuggets here. Russian forces claim to take out a Ukrainian Buk M1 SAM, so surface-to-air missile, Tilar, using a Zala Lancet loitering munition, but actually destroyed an obvious decoy. And I'll explain why it's a decoy in a second, how we're pretty sure it will be. But here it is, and this is why this is interesting, is that we know that they've been using decoy HIMARS, and that the Russians have claimed to have destroyed more HIMARS than the Ukrainians have, right? And in fact, it turns out that they haven't hit a single one. So what have they been hitting? Well, they've been hitting a lot of wooden decoys that the Ukrainians have been using. Well, here's a decoy not of the HIMARS, but of another munition, a surface-to-air missile system. So here you go. Anyway, sorry, I've just covered the play button. So here we have the system, the loitering munition. Now, there are people there. So one of the claims is that we know it's not a real one because there aren't people around it. But actually, there are a few people there that I've seen. But anyway, here it comes, and goes in, hits the installation. Bosh. Now, what you see there is some debris flying off that could well be wood. I mean, it flies off quite easily, and then all you've got is a bit of white smoke, and then that's the end, and it finishes. Now, whenever you hit something like this that involves explosive munitions, and you're hitting it on top, you're hitting the missiles, you will get these cooking off and exploding, or firing off, or you will get an explosion of fuel. So you'll have fire, and you'll get black acrid smoke that comes off, which is burning fuel and what have you. All you get here is puff of white smoke, which is the munition itself blowing up, and it just looks very much like this is a wooden piece of kit that was blown up. There you go. So the received opinion is that is a decoy. Here's something that is interesting for not what you might think I'm going to talk about. So here we have a tank. I think it's a T-64 pulling. So what is the claim here? It is a T-64 BV tank recovering a Russian 2S3 Akancia 152 mil self-propelled gun. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about is the fact that annoys me, Twitter, when you do that. When you see Ukrainian tanks, either they have really good paint jobs, generally, or APCs. They will often have very good paint jobs, or they are using camo much more effectively. Here, we see the Ukrainian tank look like a tank probably should look. And then we see the Russian kit that is just some kind of paint job from the 80s with a Z sprayed on it. And it's a similar thing that I've said before about how the Ukrainian army are dressed. Literally, they look the part. They've got the gear, and they have the equipment and the tech on them, and the camo gear. And then you look at some of the Russian soldiers who are struggling to get the correct gear, having to buy their own med kits and all this stuff. And when you see them, they are often dressed very poorly in comparison. And it's just, there's a marked difference between the two. Okay, the very last thing I'm going to talk about is the difference between direct and indirect fire. I've mentioned this before, and someone called me out because actually I said something was indirect fire because I thought a cruise missile was direct fire, but it's not. So here's some clarity. Direct fire refers to the launching of a projectile directly at a target on a relatively flat trajectory. So think about looking at someone and firing a rifle at them. Right, the firing weapon must have a sighting device and an unobstructed line of sight to the target, which means no objects or friendly units can be between it and the target. A weapon engaged in direct fire exposes itself to return fire from the target. By contrast, indirect fire refers to firing a projectile on a ballistic trajectory or delivering munitions by guided or unguided missiles. So grads or HIMARS that are either unguided or guided, but they're being fired up and then they come down on the targets. Indirect fire does not need a direct line of sight to the target because the shots are normally directed by a forward observer. So it can just be a dumb piece of munition that's fired out of a piece of artillery that goes up and comes down, and you're kind of working out where it lands using a bit of physics. As such, indirect fire weapons can shoot over obstacles or friendly units, and the weapons can be concealed from direct return fire. Now, there's a bit of grey area. You could argue, I think, is the Neptune missile that the Ukrainians use directed at ships? I don't know if that has a fairly flat trajectory, and you kind of point it at the ship, albeit a very long way away, and fire this thing, and it goes out and hits the ship in a fairly direct line of trajectory. I'm not 100% sure though, so please correct me and put your opinions down there. So there might be some grey area here, but direct and indirect fire, that's your definitions there, and hopefully I'll get that right going forward. Anyway, hope that was all of some use. Lots of stuff to discuss. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Please like, subscribe, join, support in any way. All the ways that you can support are in the description, or you can do this, which is pop along to uasupporter.com/ATP, which stands for ATP Philosopher. That's my channel. And if you buy anything from UA Supporter, a little bit of commission will come towards my channel. So that would be hugely appreciated as well. Anyway, thanks for dropping by, and I'll see you tomorrow.